When we turn to the evaluation of our folk psychology, churchland tells us that the eliminative materialist is also pessimistic about the prospects for reduction. But his reason is that folk psychology is a radically inadequate account of our internal activities, too confused and too defective to win survival through intertheoretic reduction. On his view, it will simply be displaced by a better theory of those activities. What's the basis for the eliminative materialist's pessimistic evaluation of the prospects of folk psychology? Well, churchland offers up a tripartite criterion for evaluating folk psychology and concludes, based upon its measures in these three categories, that folk psychology constitutes a stagnant or degenerating research program. Thus, churchland tells us, one ought to eliminate folk psychology, just as has been done in analogous circumstances throughout the history of science. And in his paper, he gives us several examples from the history of science of just that sort of elimination. So he discusses the elimination of the four fundamental spirits and of phlogiston in the theoretical framework of alchemy. But he could just as easily have used the elimination of vitalism, phrenology, luminiferous ether, or the expanding earth hypothesis. The first of the three criterion that churchland notes is that folk psychology represents a theory with large and serious explanatory failures, which, moreover, has little potential to explain wide swaths of mental phenomena. On page 73, he tells us, when one centers one's attention not on what folk psychology can explain, but on what it cannot explain or fails even to address, one discovers that there is a very great deal central and important mental phenomenon that remain largely or wholly mysterious within the framework of folk psychology, include the nature and dynamics of mental illness, the faculty of creative imagination, the ground of intelligence differences between individuals, and our utter ignorance of the nature and psychological functions of sleep. This failure on the part of folk psychology to explain or even to address a wide variety of seemingly significant psychological phenomenon and functions might be mitigated to some extent, churchland suggests, if folk psychology showed extraordinary promise as a theory. However, folk psychology represents a theory that's shown little, if any, promise or actual growth and development as a theory. Indeed, on page 73, churchland tells us that even in this preferred domain, however, both the content and the success of folk psychology have not advanced sensibly in 2,000 or 3,000 years. The folk psychology of the Greeks is essentially the folk psychology we use today, and we are negligibly better at explaining human behavior in its terms than was Sophocles. This brings us to the third and final criterion of theoretical evaluation, and the third failure. Folk psychology represents a theory that remains largely discontinuous or even inconsistent with other large, highly successful theories that offer explanations of some of the same phenomenon and of phenomenon in closely related domains. As churchland tells us on page 75, in short, the greatest theoretical synthesis in the history of the human race is currently in our hands, and parts of it already provide searching descriptions and explanations of human sensory input, neural activity, and motor control. But folk psychology is no part of this growing synthesis. Its intentional categories stand magnificently alone, without visible prospect of reduction to that larger corpus. So folk psychology performs abysmally on all three criterion of theoretical evaluation, and as a result, it's a prime candidate for elimination. But what does elimination amount to? It turns out that eliminativists have differing views regarding the disposition of folk psychology post-elimination. Churchland argues that we ought to eliminate folk terms from our ordinary lexicon and understand the world through the lens of the more adequate scientific theories that replace folk psychology. For instance, in Scientific Realism and the Plasticity of Mind, Churchland tells readers, it is important for us to try to appreciate, if only dimly, the extent of the perceptual transformation here envisaged. These people do not sit on the beach and listen to the steady roar of the pounding surf. They sit on the beach and listen to the aperiodic atmospheric compression waves produced as the coherent energy of the ocean waves is audibly redistributed in the chaotic turbulence of the shallows. In contrast to Churchland's view, Dan Dennett adopts a quite different view of the post-elimination world. For Dennett, we need not try to purge our ordinary discourse of folk psychology. Rather, we can recognize the rough and ready usefulness of the framework for everyday thought and reasoning, while also acknowledging that the real entities and theory of these phenomena show our ordinary notions to be woefully inadequate. In effect, we adopt a kind of pragmatic instrumentalism towards the application of folk psychology in everyday life, and defer always to the theories and theoretical entities posited by scientists in trying to explain and predict those phenomena.